Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the first working group meeting for the Silver Line Extension Alternatives Analysis. I apologize earlier for the technical difficulties that we were having earlier. Before we actually get into the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Reagan Checchio from our project team, who is going to talk about sort of the rules for participating and how to use the Zoom interface in order to participate in this meeting. Reagan?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience today. So I do just want to remind our working group members the process for participating in the meeting, as well as remind everybody that the meeting is being recorded today. So we'd ask you to remain muted when you are not speaking to prevent excessive background noise. And for working group members, if you have questions during the presentation or would like to share comments during the discussion portion, please use the raise hand feature. When we recognize you, you can unmute yourself to share your question or comment. We'd ask you that you not type your comments into the Q&A that you see at the bottom of your screen, as we would want to hear your feedback verbally, if at all possible. We'll be using the Q&A feature for public comments and questions. That being said, time permitting, we do plan to have a public comment section, but if we do run out of time, you can email us at slx@mbta.com. It also would be nice if folks who are on the line could take a moment to rename themselves to ensure that your name and affiliation are displayed correctly and make any adjustments. So with that housekeeping being done, I will turn it back over to Doug for the actual presentation.
Thank you very much, Reagan. I didn't mention this before, but my name is Doug Johnson, and I am the MassDOT project manager for the Silver Line Extension Alternatives Analysis. Before we get into the presentation, I'm actually going to ask members of the working group to introduce themselves to everyone on the call. We're only going to do this at this first meeting, just because it's the first time we're convening everyone and getting them all together. At subsequent working group meetings, we won't ask everyone to do this because it is rather time consuming, but we think it's valuable, at least in this meeting, to go through that. So I'm going to start with the state reps and senators who are on the call or their staff who are representing them. Then we'll go through our municipal staff and then our community members. I will later in the presentation talk about the makeup of the working group, how we selected who was going to be on the working group, and we'll show a full list of everyone who's represented here today. So please bear with me. I am going to be looking at our list of folks who are here and cross-referencing that with working group members so that I can call on folks as we go down. So we are going to start with, let's see, Rep. Mike Connolly.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, Doug. Rep. Mike Connolly. I represent parts of East Cambridge, Kendall Square, East Somerville, and Union Square, and certainly looking forward to the work of this effort. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Matt Hartman.
Sure, yep. I'm Senator Jalen's chief of staff, and she represents Somerville, Cambridge, parts of Cambridge, Medford, and parts of Winchester. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you for joining us. Christopher Smith.
Hey everybody, Chris Smith, Legislative Aid Office of Senator Sal DiDomenico. We represent Everett and Chelsea as it relates to this project, as well as Cambridge, from much of Cambridge, and also the West End, Alston, Brighton, and Charlestown. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Christopher Addis.
Good afternoon, Christopher Addis from Rep. Mike Connolly's office.
Thank you for joining us. Sorry, just going down the list. Maggie Randall.
Hello, I'm Maggie Randall. I'm Senator Boncory's chief of staff. The Silver Line is important to our district and to our constituents, especially in East Boston. So we're excited to be involved.
Thank you. Rep. Ryan.
Hello, hi, Representative Dan Ryan, representing the great city of Chelsea and the Boston neighborhood of Charlestown. Thank you for bringing us all together. Look forward to continued discussions.
Thank you very much for joining us. That looks like it might be it for reps, senators, and their staff. If there's anyone on this call who is a representative or a senator or representing one, if you could please go ahead and unmute yourselves and introduce yourselves. Hearing none, I think we have everyone who at least is on the call at this moment. We may have a few folks who are still joining us due to the technical difficulties we were experiencing earlier. Now, I would like to go through the list of staff from municipalities who are represented on the working group. I will start with Allie Clayman.
Hello, my name is Allie Clayman. I'm a senior transportation planner in the Office of Mobility for the city of Somerville.
Thanks, Allie. And I know that Brad Rawson was planning on joining us for the beginning of the call and asked to say a few words, but it doesn't appear that he's joined at the moment.
He is on. I think he maybe needs to be unmuted or something.
Sorry, yes, we sent him the.
I just allowed Brad to unmute himself, so you should be able to speak now, Brad.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Brad Rawson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Brad Rawson, representing Mayor Joe Curtatone in the great city of Somerville. I want to take a moment and thank our partners at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, the MBTA. I want to say hello and send the mayor's greetings to our neighbors in the city of Chelsea, in the city of Everett, the city of Boston, the city of Cambridge, and anybody else who is missing from that list. I'm a Somerville resident. I had the pleasure and the honor and responsibility of serving as Mayor Joe's delegate to the Secretary's mandated Lower Mystic Regional Working Group, a mitigation measure coming out of the Commonwealth's decision to permit the Encore Casino in Everett. And I'm just so pleased that Mass DOT has taken the great ideas that came out of that important work to launch this long-range integrated land use and transportation planning process. Allie Clayman, our senior staffer in my office, will serve as the city's delegate, but we take a great deal of interdisciplinary and long-range ownership and responsibility for this work because we all have a shared vision of equitable, affordable housing, of community-based economic and workforce development, low carbon mobility, and rectifying the failed policies of the past that have left too many of our neighborhoods breathing terrible air, resulting in direct COVID morbidity, and many other long-term equity issues that we're all trying to solve. Mass transit is the way that we do so. So I want to say thanks again to Mass DOT and MBTA, and just know, folks, that we represent you at the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, and this capital planning is really important to our residents, to our elected officials, to our mayor and our staff. So really look forward to the next couple of years together.
Thank you very much, Brad. Now, Jay Monty.
Everybody, Jay Monty, I'm the Director of Transportation for the City of Everett. I want to just echo everything Brad said about the importance of this project, the level of collaboration between the communities, Everett, Somerville, Chelsea, Boston, Cambridge. This project for us goes back to the Everett Transit Action Plan of, I think, almost 6 years ago now, which is, I think, in our mind, kind of set off a little bit of a revolution in Everett with regard to the bus lanes, regard to a whole rethinking of how we look at transit in the community. This project specifically, the potential right now, we've in the last year permitted almost 3,000 new units of housing in the area where the Silver Line is likely going to travel. So this is key. This is key to continuing to provide housing both market rate and affordable. Is key to the redevelopment of a pretty large swath of land here in Everett as well as in Chelsea. So we're just really excited and thankful that MassDOT is taking this on, and we're looking forward to working with you all over the next year and a half.
Thanks, Jay. Alex Train.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Train. I'm the Director of Housing and Community Development with the City of Chelsea, here on behalf of City Manager Tom Ambrosino. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this study. Our major goal from Chelsea's end is to see the community's voice and interests represented in this process. The Silver Line, as many know, have contributed to widespread gentrification and housing cost pressures in our community. So we're interested in a study that really centers our residents first and foremost, and happy to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Suzanne Rasmussen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this effort on behalf of the City of Cambridge. Clearly what we're talking about here meets all of our equity, mobility, greenhouse gas, and growth goals, and as well as housing goals. So very excited to be part of it, and have been seeking since, well, as long as I've worked here, which is quarter century, to have these connections strengthened among the cities that are represented here today. So I very much appreciate the effort and look forward to positive, actionable outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Vineet Gupta.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vineet Gupta. I'm the Planning Director at the Boston Transportation Department. Looking forward to working with everybody. I should mention that Matt Moran, who is, I don't think he's on the call, but he's our Transit Team Director here at BTD. So he'll be participating. But I do know that Nick Schmidt and Jim Fitzgerald, both from the BPDA, are also on this call. So you have the full team from the city of Boston. Thanks.
Thanks, Vineet. Happy to have you all here with us today. Now we'll turn to our staff from MAPC. Eric Barassa.
Hi, yeah, I'm Eric Barassa. I'm the Director of Transportation Planning with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, MAPC. And yeah, we're very excited. This alternatives analysis for the Silver Line extension is really one of the marquee recommendations from the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group study that MAPC led a few years ago, looking at the solutions to traffic in the Sullivan Square area as a result of both the casino and all the other development that's occurring there. And so we're really excited for this effort to move forward. And I'm glad so many municipal officials, state leaders, and other advocacy groups are incorporated into this effort. So thank you, MassDOT and MBTA, and look forward to this process.
Thanks, Eric. Travis Pollock.
Hello, I'm Travis Pollock. I work with Eric in the transportation group here at MAPC, and just want to echo that we're very excited. And in addition to Lower Mystic Regional Working Group, we've been also happy to work with a lot of the partners that we see here on other bus improvements for the area. So any way we can do that, very happy to do so. It's good to see this group. Thanks.
Thanks, Travis. Now I'll turn to the members of the community who are nominated by mayors and city managers to serve on this body. We'll start with Maria Bellin Powers.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Bellin, and I'm the Associate Executive Director at Green Roots. We are an environmental justice organization working in Chelsea and East Boston. And as you all know, Chelsea and East Boston have been hardest hit by the pandemic, Chelsea being the epicenter and East Boston being the hardest hit neighborhood of the city of Boston. So we're really concerned about transit dependent riders and residents who have no other choice but to take public transit, concerned about gentrification and affordability, especially in the context of service cuts. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maria Bellin. Now, Julia Wallers.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Julia Wallers here. I am the Boston Program Manager for the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP. We're a global nonprofit, have been working here in the Boston region for the last 5 to 7 years, specifically on exploring opportunities for bus rapid transit. Most recently, our work has focused in Everett on the Broadway corridor, exploring a one-seat ride from Broadway to downtown Boston. And we're absolutely thrilled to see the scope of this project expand to include this corridor and some of these routes, all building off of, the Lower Mystic study and previous momentum that has, been really building over recent years to bridge mobility and equity gaps. So we're very excited to be part of these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Now, Julia Toof.
Hi, I'm Julia Toof. I serve on the Somerville Pedestrian and Transit Advisory Council, and I'm also on the Infrastructure Subcommittee. I live in East Somerville, so I'm along one of the corridors that will be discussed, and previously had been a pedestrian commuter through Sullivan Square, although not currently since I'm working remotely. And I had lived in Charlestown as well for years. So when I saw the proposed routes, I was really excited because I happen to have lived along a couple of the corridors for years.
Thank you very much for joining us. Last but not least, we have Joseph Aiello, who looks like he may not be here. And I should note that that is not the chair of the FMCB. That is a resident of the city of Cambridge who coincidentally has the same name.
And
There
Doug,
seems to be
Doug,
one
I'm
in
sorry.
every city. It's crazy.
Yes, Reagan.
Doug, this is Reagan. Just wanted to point out Representative Livingston also joined us as well.
Thank you very much. Representative, would you mind introducing yourself to everyone?
Sure. Jay Livingstone, State Representative, representing parts of East Cambridge and Central Square in Cambridge, and then in Boston, the West End, Beacon Hill, and Back Bay. I'm glad to be here. Glad this is happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. I believe that's everyone on all the official members of the stakeholder working group. Thank you all very much for bearing with us as we went through that. I know it's time consuming, but I do think it's really valuable that you all have the opportunity to introduce yourselves to each other. So as I mentioned, we will not do that at every meeting of the stakeholder working group, but we thought it was important to do it at this one. I also want to take a moment to recognize the members of the project team who are joining us here today. From the MBTA, we have Kat Benesh, the Chief of Operations, Strategy, Policy, and Oversight. We have Melissa DeLay, the Senior Director of Service Planning, and Wes Edwards, the Assistant General Manager of Service Development. We also have Bruce Kaplan from Central Transportation Planning staff joining us. And we have several of my colleagues from the Massachusetts Department of Transportation joining us as well. Before we get into the real presentation, I just want to talk about sort of how we'll take public comment and how this meeting will go. Members of the public can submit questions and comments using the Q&A feature on Zoom. If you're a member of the working group, please don't use that. Please raise your hand and then unmute yourself when we recognize you. If you want to respond to someone immediately in a comment that they've made, feel free to unmute yourself right away and chime in. We really want this to be as conversational as it possibly can be, given the limitations of the Zoom platform. So please don't be shy, don't hesitate to interject or to make comments, but please don't use the Q&A feature. We're reserving that for members of the public. If time allows at the end of this meeting, we will take questions from the public. Considering the technical difficulties we had earlier though, and the time that it is now, I am very doubtful that we will get to that part of the presentation. So for members of the public who are listening to this, if you have questions or comments and we're unable to get to them at the end of the meeting, you can email the project email and we'll get back to you. That's slx@mbta.com. Great. Now we have a pretty packed agenda today, which you can see here on the first slide. We just went through welcome introductions. I'm gonna go through a brief project overview and talk about the role of the working group. Then we'll get into the study goals and objectives. And then we have about 30 slides of existing conditions analysis that we'd really like to share with you, but it's doubtful that we'll get through all of that content either. But please know that for all of the members on the working group, we will be reaching out to you after this meeting to schedule follow-up meetings where we'll go through all of that content with you, get more input from you. We're also planning on posting the presentation to our project website, and we'll be posting the recording of this meeting on that website as well. So we'll have many follow-up conversations with you. Don't worry about it if we don't get through all of the content. The most important thing for us is that we have a really robust discussion around the goals and objectives for this study. Those really lay the groundwork for all of the work that is to come, whether it's defining alternatives or actually analyzing those alternatives. So we want to make sure that we have agreement on those goals and objectives to the extent possible, and we really are on the same page before we really move forward into this process. So with that, I think we can get underway. Many of you have already seen the content in this section. Given the limitations of how much time we have, I am going to try to go through it fairly quickly. So I apologize if I seem to be rushing through it, but I really want to get to the stuff that is the most important. Project purpose, many of you are familiar with this. The purpose of this study is to assess the feasibility, utility, and cost of various alignment and service frequency options for an extension of the Silver Line, providing high quality transit from Chelsea through Everett and onto Somerville, Cambridge, and or Boston. So that's really the The what are we doing? And then the project need is really why are we doing this? I don't think that the content on this slide is going to be news to anyone who is on this working group. You all likely know that Everett and Chelsea are not well connected to each other by transit or to the rest of the region. Transit services that do exist are not particularly competitive with driving for most trips. That said, over the last 12 months during the pandemic, ridership in Everett and Chelsea has actually remained quite high relative to the rest of the system. So as you all know, there's a lot of bus service in this area, and we can build on that and leverage that to make further improvements in the system. But as you know, the existing bus service is not serving these communities as well as it could be. Next slide, please. We also recognize that there are many other efforts going on at the same time as this study, namely bus transformation and the bus network redesign. This study fits into both of those initiatives, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in subsequent slides. There's also an ongoing Wellington Circle study that's being conducted by MassDOT. We are coordinating with that effort. There's the McGrath Boulevard project in Somerville. We are coordinating with the folks, the team that worked on that, and are advancing work around that. And then there are several bus priority projects in the region that have impacts on our study and any alternatives that we may analyze. So we are coordinating with the transit priority team at the MBTA, as well as several other departments for this effort. So I mentioned bus transformation. Bus transformation is an initiative of the MBTA that really encompasses all of the other initiatives that are underway to really transform the bus system. Obviously, the Silver Line extension needs to fit into that because we are looking at bus service throughout this area. So on this slide, it shows the 6 pillars of bus transformation. You can see it's probably obvious to everyone that service and street design is really one of the places where this project interfaces the most with bus transformation. But it's also really important to note that this study needs to be grounded in the bus maintenance facility modernization plan and the fleet procurement strategy at the T. This effort needs to go hand in hand with those and be informed by those processes as we go forward, so that we know, what the capacity or capability of the system are for any alternatives that we may analyze. Next slide, please. So this is our study area. We determine the bounds of the study area by reviewing the plans that preceded this one, namely the Everett Transit Action Plan and the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group Report. We mapped all of the alignments or proposals that those plans included, and then we included a buffer around those for both walk sheds for any transit service and uncertainty around any alignments. And that leaves us with what we have here. You can see that the study area extends up Broadway in Everett. It also extends to the west over to Wellington, and then sort of along Route 28 down to Kendall. So this is just meant to be sort of all encompassing of any potential alignments that we analyze. It also allows us to include, development areas that may have a lot of implications for future ridership by generating a lot of trips. Actually, if you can go back to that for 1 second, please. If anyone has any questions on this, I can pause here for a moment if anyone has any questions or comments. I know this is familiar to many folks on this call. Hearing none, we can proceed. This is our project schedule. I'm just going to run through this really quickly, both for the sake of the folks who haven't seen this before and for anyone who is watching the recording of this later. Each row is a task included in our scope of work, and you can see the description of each one of those, as well as how many months we anticipate to be doing each of those things. Yellow stars are working group meetings. So this first one here is right at the beginning of February. Red stars are when we're anticipating having public information meetings. The goals and objectives and study area task, that's obviously ongoing and has been ongoing since this project started. That's really the phase we're in right now. We want to finalize our goals and objectives. We essentially finalized our study area. We're also undertaking our existing conditions analysis, and we have some of the preliminary findings to show you today. And then we'll be getting into the future no-build condition analysis in the next month. And then in February and March, we're anticipating actually getting into the definition of alternatives. We're going to have a lot of meetings with individual meetings with our stakeholders during that phase, including the next stakeholder working group meeting where we bring everyone together sometime in March. And then we'll have our first public meeting right after that, and then get into the alternatives analysis, where there'll be many meetings during that phase as well. At the end of the process, hopefully we are in a place where we can select a preferred alternative out of all the alternatives that we've analyzed, and the project team will put together a report that documents that in the process. And then we've also left ourselves some time to do an environmental notification form, should we feel that it's necessary to do that at the end of the process. So the role of the working group, why you are all here today. Really, we wanted to bring this group together to provide input and informed advice on this process and make sure that any work we're doing is really hand in hand with other efforts that are underway, and are really taking into consideration the needs of each of our communities within our study area. We want this process to be as collaborative as possible, which is why we've brought you all here today, and we've had many conversations with many of you leading up to this. So please feel free to participate as much as you want, unmute yourselves. If you have comments, please share them with us. And also don't hesitate to reach out directly with us as well. We can go to the next slide. This is a list of the first half of our list of members of our stakeholder working group. You can see here we have the staff from various municipalities. We also have nominees from different cities. So in order to determine who would be on this working group, we reached out to the mayors and city managers of each of our participating municipalities and asked them to designate a staff member and nominate a community member if they chose to. You can see the list here of folks who were either designated or nominated to be on this group. And then of course, we also asked 2 staff from MAPC to participate as well, because the work that they did with the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report really helped bring this study into existence. On the second slide here, you'll see a list of state senators and representatives. We included all of the state senators and representatives whose districts overlap with our study area. There are a couple folks who are not represented here yet. We have reached out to their offices and are just waiting for confirmation that they'll be participating with us. But the finalized list will be posted on the project website in the next few days.
And Doug, it does appear that Representative Madero has joined us.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out. Representative, if you'd like to introduce yourself for a moment, please do.
Hi, sorry about that. The representative himself wasn't able to make it today, but this is Stephen Gingera from his office, and we're happy to be represented and to join you as you do this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We appreciate it. I think we can go to the next slide. So we have a pretty robust stakeholder and public engagement process that we're going to carry out over the next 12 months or so. This slide does not fully capture all of the work that we're going to be doing. It's sort of a sample of that work, or a high-level overview of it. At the most simple level, we have a project website up. You can go check it out. We're going to have 4 of these working group meetings, 3 public information meetings, probably close to a dozen or 8 to 12 small neighborhood briefings in various communities throughout our study area to get direct input from folks. We're also meeting with elected officials, obviously, having lots of meetings with our participating municipalities. And we're going to be doing other things like surveying bus riders in multiple languages, trying to do as much direct outreach as we can, and really, connecting with community-based organizations who are going to help us get, input and talk to folks directly throughout this process. So this is something that we'll certainly want feedback from as we meet with all of you after this meeting. If you have advice or things you want to share with us, we're happy to take that in as we sort of finish formulating that plan. So as I mentioned, the definition of alternatives, which is really the next major step in this process. That's where we take in all of the ideas that could potentially be analyzed as part of this study, and then we put them through an evaluation framework to see if it makes sense to move them forward into analysis. And I'll go a little bit more into that in the next slide, but basically at the highest level, we've divided our study area up into 4 geographic segments. We have the current terminal of the SL3 in Chelsea to Broadway and Everett. Then we have Broadway approximately around Glendale Square to the Orange Line, And then we have the Orange Line to Kendall and North Station. And then within each one of those areas, we're going to be looking at a number of different possibilities. So for instance, if we're considering, extending the SL3 to Glendale Square from Chelsea, for example, there are actually several routes in between that any potential service could use. So we need to evaluate any of those alignments for various things like whether there's enough right-of-way, what kind of impacts there would be, what the ridership potential is, stuff like that. So that's how we've divided up our study area. Next slide, please. Here's the evaluation process that I was talking about. It's really 3 steps. We start with an initial screening of any ideas to see if those ideas meet our project purpose. Then things that do meet our project purpose will go into the tier 1 evaluation. We'll really screen for things like engineering feasibility and see which really makes sense. And we'll talk about the criteria that we'll use later that actually comes out of the goals and objectives. And then once we do the tier 1 evaluation, we sort of link together those different pieces and analyze routes as a whole. And that's where we start to get into things like modeling ridership potential, air quality impacts, that kind of stuff. And then hopefully out of that process, we come to an agreement on a preferred alternative. This is a list of many of the components of the alternatives analysis. So this is really that, that final stage of the process. Although some of these bullets, I guess, do fall into that middle stage of the process. But we're going to be doing things like creating conceptual roadway designs, doing an operational analysis of any alternatives that includes, what fleet requirements would there be, what kind of service frequency we would be looking at, how long would the service run, all that kind of stuff, where bus stops would go. We're also, as I mentioned, going to have CTPS model our alternatives in that final stage to see what the ridership potential of them will be. And then we'll be looking at things like traffic and parking impacts, pedestrian and bicycle access, land impacts, planning consistency. That's really important, to making sure that the alternatives are consistent with the plans that have been laid out by our municipal partners. And then of course, things like air quality, environmental justice impacts, and then construction schedule and cost estimates for any alternatives that we advance to that final stage. So that is a really quick 11-minute overview of this entire process. I know that was a lot of information, but hopefully it was familiar to many of you. The next part of this presentation is really going to be a discussion around our proposed goals and objectives. But before we get into that, we wanted to open it up to the floor, see if that content that we showed so far has elicited any comments or questions from folks, and really see if folks have any ideas that they want to share at this stage about what outcomes they really want to see from this process. I know Brad, Jay, Alex, Suzanne, Vinny all talked about that a little bit in their opening introductions, but we wanted to give folks another opportunity to talk about this and pause here for a minute if anyone has any thoughts or comments. So if you do, please use the raise hand feature and then we'll recognize you. And if somebody makes a comment that you would like to respond to directly, feel free to unmute yourself and respond to them directly. So we'll open up to the floor. Does anybody, of course, Brad Rossin would like to make a comment. Please, Brad, go ahead.
Doug, I'm going to take that with love. Did you say, of course? Yes, of course. Thank you so much.
Sorry, a slip of the tongue.
I think part of our role in the city of Somerville is to constantly challenge ourselves and all of our project partners to think out of the box and to not bring yesterday's tools to today and tomorrow's problems. So here's an example that will lead to a question, Doug. I know that many of our core transportation and land use planning models address an issue of grave concern to many of our stakeholders, which is air pollution, and specifically the air pollution derived from transportation sources. In the city of Somerville, we have built a 10-year data record of real-time air pollution monitoring in our environmental justice communities in Winter Hill and East Somerville. And one of the things that we have learned is that when municipalities like Chelsea, Everett, Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge do courageous things, and I want to recognize Mass DOT as well here, and we reprioritize road space away from general purpose travel and to low carbon, high capacity mass transit, we actually find co-benefits including reduction of ambient air pollution in the neighborhoods we are serving. And so a question and then a commercial as always, which is, I hope that our modeling tools are sympathetic enough and can be calibrated to leverage this state-of-the-art data collection. And I would hope that the solutions that we all address together recognize that state highways and high capacity municipal controlled roadways can and should continue to be prioritized for on-street bus transit. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. It looks like Bruce Kaplan from CTPS would like to.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Thanks, Brad. Absolutely. Absolutely. We could use that. And our models are sensitive to some of the issues you brought up in terms of modeling low carbon transportation options. And they have shown kind of the things that you've also shown by your actual empirical, data collection, that things go down. So that's always a good thing to know and see that, the stuff we've predicted actually happened. So yeah, we look forward to getting some of that data and working with you on that.
Thank you, Bruce. Jay Monty.
Thanks, Doug. So I think, I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of housing development happening in this portion of the city. For us, this is a major opportunity. This is an area that has been, underutilized for years. It's an area where we can provide a large amount of housing, like I said, both market rate and affordable. And with that, we're also making a lot of commitments to improve our city streets to accommodate transit in the future. We're also making a big ask of our developers to contribute as well. And I would note that we have 3 or 4 developments right now that have committed in their planning board approvals to dedicate right-of-way back to the streets for transit priority, specifically the Silver Line. So for us, we talk about the design of the streets, the ability to actually run a fast and efficient service. I think what we want to make sure comes out of this is that it's a bus. This bus rapid transit, it needs to operate in all the ways that we and the advocates talk about bus rapid transit being able to meet the same levels of service, same levels of speed and comfort as a subway or a rail option would. So I hope that will be front and center in a lot of this as well. That Everett stands as I think really one of the only communities here that does not have access to a rail station currently. So we're excited to move forward on BRT, but it needs to be the type of BRT that can provide that high quality level of service that we're currently missing.
Thank you, Jay. We really appreciate that feedback. And we're really looking forward to working with you on that as well. Vineet?
Yeah, thanks. And I may be kind of preempting what you're going to talk later, but I think it's really important when I'm looking at these outcomes to go to the next level of detail and really establish perhaps even aspirational kind of metrics as to what it means to improve transit quality of service, for example. So is this about reliability or is it about travel times? Or if you look at economic growth, is this about jobs or is it about connecting people in low-income areas to jobs, or job growth, or just connectivity to existing jobs? I think it's really important to kind of have a shared understanding of what it means to kind of get a deeper, kind of be more specific about each of these outcomes. And I'm assuming that's part of the next level of discussion.
That is correct. Yes. Thank you, Vineet. This is a perfect segue into the next part of the presentation, actually. But I couldn't agree more with you. Before we do get into that, I see Suzanne also has her hand raised.
I'll be fast. I just wanted to echo Brad's point about understanding and to what extent we tolerate the impact on general purpose traffic in our evaluation of these different alternatives, because that will be very important to be on the same page. And I just using this example, the decision that was made regarding the bus bridge between Leechmere and North Station, there's an understanding that there was going to be an impact, but that being able to run the exclusive bus lanes took priority. So we need to collectively have an understanding in how we evaluate the different alternatives from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Couldn't agree more, and we look forward to reaching a shared consensus on that. I think with that, unless anyone else has their hand raised, we can get into a discussion of our goals and objectives. Looks like we're ready to go. Great. Yeah. So if the project need, excuse me, the project purpose and the project need are the, what are we trying to do and why are we trying to do it? The goals and objectives are really, how do we measure whether we're actually succeeding or not in doing what we said we set out to do, or solving the problem that we are trying to solve. But thankfully, we're not starting from scratch with our goals and objectives. There have been a lot of efforts underway over the last few years that really have informed this process and fed into the goals and objectives that we've drafted. So when we get into those in a moment, hopefully you see sort of how that process has influenced where we are today. But I wanted to start with this brief timeline of the last few years to sort of lay the context for where the study is coming from and how we got here. As you all know, back in 2012, the Silver Line Gateway study got underway. That ultimately led to construction of the SL3 and the Silver Line busway through Chelsea. In 2016, the Everett Transit Action Plan was conducted in partnership with MassDOT. That led to the piloting of an inbound peak hour bus lane on Broadway, which was later made permanent. And that really laid the groundwork for future bus lane projects in that area. In 2020, an outbound bus lane was added. A bus lane was added to Main Street, and we now have bus lanes in Sweester Circle, which from what or at least as far as I know, is the only traffic circle I could find that has bus lanes in it, or perhaps maybe not the only, but one of the first, which is a huge accomplishment. While many of those efforts were underway, many of our municipal partners were also finalizing comprehensive plans or transportation plans that really laid out goals and objectives for each of those communities. And we drew from those when we started drafting our goals and objectives. So Go Boston 2030 was released in 2017. In 2019, the MBTA finalized Focus 40, which is the long-range investment plan. At the same time, the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report was finalized and released in 2019. And as I mentioned, that plan really laid the groundwork for this one. It recommended studying 2 different services that would serve the Chelsea, Everett, East Somerville, East Cambridge areas and connect to Kendall Square and downtown. Cambridge also finished their comprehensive plan, Envision Cambridge, and then recently in 2020, the city of Somerville did the same. So that has really, provided the framework that we've used to draft our goals and objectives, as I mentioned. And you can see sort of on the right-hand side here, this is where we are now. We started this process late in 2020. It's going to run all throughout this year and then wrap up in the spring of 2022. But the other thing I want to mention about why we looked at all of those municipal plans is any alternatives that we ultimately analyze are likely to use on-road right-of-way that are owned by municipalities. So it's especially important that any decisions that we make, any alternatives that we analyze are, fit the vision and the goals of each of those communities that this goes through. This really needs to be a collaborative process. It can't be one that's just, dictated by us. It needs to be hand in hand with each of you so that we make sure that, we're delivering a project that you all believe in and it fits the needs of your community, as well as, our constituents as well. So that's a long-winded way of saying, why goals and objectives are really important. They really provide the framework that we'll use for evaluating any of our alternatives. So we talked about that evaluation process earlier. We are still finalizing the exact details of that process, but the first step is really coming to agreement on our goals and objectives. This is basically a prerequisite to advancing any further in this process. So we can go to the next slide. So we start with Focus 40. This is the document that this study really came out of, and it identify goals of sustainability, livability, equity and affordable housing, and economic competitiveness and prosperity. Then we looked at the goals for bus transformation, which are on the next slide. And bus transformation, as I mentioned, is a much larger process that encompasses many different components, but there are several goals related to it that really are important for us to mention in this process. So one of the main goals of bus transformation is creating a route network that goes where people need to go when they need it and is simple to use. Makes sense that that would be a guiding principle for us, right? And there's a core network of high priority corridors with all day frequent service supported by transit priority facilities and infrastructure. That gets into what I was mentioning earlier about bus transformation. And then lastly, a fast, reliable, and competitive bus experience that includes all-door boarding and safe, accessible, and comfortable bus stops and busways. So that last point about all-door boarding, that will be realized by the fare transformation, or excuse me, transformation effort. But all of these goals really tie into the goals of Silver Line Extension and inform our process. That Focus 40, bus transformation, bus network redesign are really our starting point that we can then build off from there, in addition to all of your municipal plans that we've looked at. So the next slide lists out many of those. And I mentioned some of that timeline. For the city of Chelsea, there are actually several studies that have been undertaken in the last few years that we are drawing goals and objectives from for this. And then on the next slide, we have the first page of our list of goals. So to Vineet's point, these are more specific than the prior slide that we showed, but they're still not as specific as they will get to be. Really, the first step is identifying what we're calling these goal areas and the objectives that fit within those. And then once we've all reached agreement on these, we will talk about how each of these objectives will actually be measured using the data that we've acquired. So the first goal broadly is expand mobility and access. Obviously that's, the goals are very general principles. And then the objectives are meant to actually be measurable. So we will define measurements for each of these objectives, and that's how we'll know whether we're successful in meeting these or not. But before we can get to that point, we need to make sure that we're on the same page on these and everyone agrees with the way that these are worded and how we've laid this out. So I have shared this with many of our municipal partners. Hopefully you've already seen it. I'm not going to read these slides out loud, but we will pause here for just a second. And if we have another page of this as well, but if anybody has any comments on these initial goals and objectives, we're happy to open it up to the floor if anyone wants to share anything. We do have sort of a more facilitated discussion scheduled for later or right after this, but if anybody has any comments just off the cuff that they want to share, we're happy to. Yes, Suzanne, please.
Very quickly, on the next one, under safety, it would be good to also recognize bicycle access, as this will be more like rapid transit, and certainly people will want to connect. So things like access and parking and things like that. Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne. That's a great point. We'll make sure that we incorporate that into there. And we're really explicit about that. Any other? Yes, Vineet, please.
I was going to say that presumably we would look at these goals relative to existing conditions. And so we might be able to establish some numerical kind of aspirations. So for example, I'm just making this up, reliable transit access is available to 20% of environmental justice communities. We would strive for 30%. I'm making this up, but is it possible to get to that level of it'll help us focus in on what we are trying to transform, so to speak.
Certainly, yes, that is the next step of this process. So we've drafted the first draft of our overall evaluation framework that details that whole process and incorporates these goals and objectives. And and starts to get at how each one will be measured. We wanted to get your input at this level before we get into that next level of doing that, but that will really be the next step of this process. And when we meet with all of you after this meeting, when we meet with you one-on-one, we'll talk about that evaluation framework and what each of those metrics actually are. It looks like maybe there was another hand, maybe not. I think we're doing pretty well for time. I think, yeah, we can go forward. So I mentioned the evaluation process. I just wanted to bring this up again to show you what we're thinking of for this process. So the goals and objectives and actually measuring whether we are meeting those goals both takes place during the tier 1 evaluation and the tier 2 evaluation. So the tier 1 evaluation, we're doing it at a segment by segment level as we go along. We look at different alignments for different routes and we say, you know, first of all, is this feasible from an engineering perspective? And if it is, then how does it stack up with our goals and objectives? Obviously, you know, some of those questions really need to be asked at the entire route level. They can't necessarily be answered at a segment by segment level, but we will be analyzing each segment to the extent possible before we get into that tier 2 evaluation. And obviously in that tier 1 evaluation, you know, when we're looking at things like what's the ridership potential for a segment, we're looking at different segments to see if some would potentially yield better connections or more access for riders than others. So things like that in tier 1. And then, as I mentioned, tier 2, we look at the entire route and see how that stacks up. And I think we can go into the next slide, which really is meant to be a facilitated discussion about these things and give us some time to digest this and talk about it.
Great. So
yeah, Teresa, would you like to take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks. So hi, everybody. I do want to reiterate what Doug said at the very beginning, which is, you know, the main objective of today is to have a robust discussion around the framework of how we're going to make decisions. And so we do take the space here to ask a series of discussion questions, and we are looking forward to a good dialogue around this. We have a ton of slides after this about existing conditions and what we've learned so far. We never anticipated that we would have all the time that we would need to go into that. But if, you know, we get through this piece, we'll get through as much of his existing conditions as we can. Otherwise, we will have that information available to you and are happy to do a follow-up. But I have here 4 questions, and I'd like to take this one by one. And again, we'll do the raise hands and call on people, but also feel free to take yourself off of mute if you have a response to something. We're really trying to simulate what we would have as an in-person working group conversation and trying to do that on Zoom. So here are the 4 questions. The first is, what do you think of the draft purpose and the draft need statement that we've put together so far? The whole reason why we're doing this study. Are we getting it right so far? The second is, do you have any suggested changes to our study area, the area where we're looking to do all of our analysis? The third is anything missing from our proposed goals and objectives? And then the fourth is, do you have thoughts or concerns about how we go about the evaluation process that Doug just described? So let's take this one by one. The first is, what do you think of our draft purpose statement? And what do you think of our draft need statement? And if it was so long ago that you don't remember, I did copy that slide here so that you have it handy and top of mind. So basically, remember, the purpose of this study is to look at feasibility, utility, and cost of various alignment and service frequency options that extend the Silver Line, providing high quality transit from Chelsea through Everett and then on to Somerville, Cambridge, and or Boston. And then the need statement that we've come up to date has to do with capacity and connectivity, knitting together Chelsea and Everett with nearby communities that are not currently well connected with high quality transit. So thoughts, concerns, anything that you would add or anything that you see is missing? Or did we get it perfect the first time? Any?
Can I speak? I don't seem to have a raise hand function. Are we supposed to? On my screen, like I don't have that button that lets me raise my hand, so I'm not sure how to properly request.
I think you can also just raise your hand.
Just
so,
like a physical hand.
Vinny,
It's hard.
Vinny, would you mind if Julia went first?
Not at all, please.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah, usually there's like a little hand or reaction or something. I don't have that on this interface, but I just wanted to add, I mean, this is great and it's fantastic that we're starting this. This is like a very big picture project by default, by nature, but I think we can be a little more ambitious in explaining what we mean by adding transit service. Like, how about just using the word rapid transit service? Like, this is not just a new bus line. We're not just trying to add here's a route, let's just connect the dots. No, what is that service? What is that infrastructure that supports that level of service that currently does not exist? I mean, this is going through places where there's not service, period, but if we're going to create this new service, let's make it the best, let's make it world class. You know, let's use bus rapid transit as a goal. You know, it might not be feasible geometrically or even politically in some parts of it, but for that to be sort of the barometer that we strive for, I think we could add even just the word, rapid transit, bus rapid transit into our purpose.
Thank you. Vinny?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to reveal my lack of reading up and familiarizing myself with the background, but the and or, I really, is that because the options can be one or the other or both? I really don't want to get into a fight with Suzanne. Because, I'm going to lose every time.
Thanks for that question, actually. That's more to recognize the variability that exists. Like as Julia mentioned, this is a pretty large and all-encompassing effort. We're going to be looking at lots of different alignments, lots of different ideas. And ultimately over the course of this project, we're going to be deciding, what makes sense, what doesn't, what's feasible, what's not. And we want that process to be as collaborative as it can be. But we don't want to, pick certain folks and say like, oh, we're promising one thing or another to anyone. It's really, we need to go through this whole process and see what makes sense coming out of the end of the alternatives. So yeah, it's really to reflect the fact that there is that uncertainty, and we need to go through our alternatives analysis before we can make any decisions about what is actually feasible and can be delivered.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm all in favor of getting rid of the R, but if you want to give that sense, that's fine. I think we should try to be a little, try to see if we can, given that it's a overall purpose statement, it's better for it to be aspirational. But I'm open to leaving it to and or. It's really up to you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, why not set the bar high, right?
I think Eric was next.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to also add in terms of the project, maybe more of the project need. And I don't know if I completely caught this, but when we did the Lower Mystic study, one of the things that we looked at was what is the growth potential in this area. And what we found was that this area is probably going to see an increase. I forget what was our outer year, if it was 2030 or 2040 at the time, but we were looking at somewhere in the realm of like 90,000 people increase in population to this area, which is similar to the geography that is, I think this is in this study as well in terms of the study area, and an increase of like 70,000 jobs. And so just a tremendous growth area in our region, probably one of the, if you define this as its own sort of sub-region, one of the highest growth areas, in Massachusetts, if not New England. And so I think also part of the need is just how do we make sure that that growth, that more of those trips are walk, bike, and public transit trips. So when we're talking about growth, it's Sullivan. There's going to be a tremendous growth in Sullivan Square once the the Rutherford Ave project is complete, there'll be, many developable parcels there. Everett has a lot of plans. There's so much growth potential along Broadway and that triangle area. And then Interbelt, and Assembly Row. So this is a big growth area, and making these connections both for, I think, the people who, the kind of the population that's currently existing, but the population of the future. We also, as a part of that analysis, we assumed, that the rate of affordable housing, which is quite high in this area, would remain. And obviously those are decisions that the cities and towns have to make, but we feel that there's strong commitment from Somerville and Boston and Chelsea and Everett in that realm. But the other big piece was also limiting the amount of free parking and trying to price parking or reduce the ratios associated with new growth. And we did incorporate some assumptions about that into the modeling as well. So I think a part of the need is also about accommodating this future growth in this area, which we see, and making sure that more of those trips are, not in single occupant vehicles.
Thank you.
Hey, sorry, that's a really good point, and we try to be really explicit about that in our goals and objectives, but we can do a better job of being explicit about that here in the project need.
Jay?
Yeah, and actually, Julia and Eric, I think, covered most of what I wanted to say. Just, rapid transit, I think the word rapid, I appreciate Julia. Adding that one word, I think, goes a long way for us, again, because we don't have rapid transit in Everett today. So that's a great suggestion. And also to Eric's point, the growth potential along this corridor in Everett, it's huge, it's happening. We're doing our best to set our policies and plans accordingly, but what I want to make sure this project does is, not make the mistake of what happened in South Boston, which was build the Silver Line, but it was not adequate to actually accommodate the growth. So just thinking along those two lines, I think are really important.
Thank you. Alex, and then Maria Belen.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Doug, thank you for the informative presentation this afternoon and for all the effort you've put into this. So I just wanted to touch on sort of one goal / objective that I always seem to have in my mind as we head into these regional or statewide transportation studies. And it kind of touches on what Eric was referencing in terms of growth potential for the region. Unbridled growth is like buying a bunch of GameStop stock in the market and just letting it fly upwards. Unbridled growth really warrants management, and growth management is something that has always been somewhat disconnected from transportation policy in this state, since transportation and land use happen at two different spatial levels and amongst two different sort of government units. But we have an amazing opportunity, I think, with this study, with all these municipalities at the table, to really coordinate our local land use policy to ensure that any growth that could be spurred by this extension is moderated, is equitable, and can sort of assist or aid those that are the most vulnerable, as opposed to displacing them. I guess our big worry here is that, with any form of new transit service, unless you have well thought out land use policies and zoning sort of policies on the ground, that it can simply lead to further gentrification. So I would encourage that this might seem like it's outside of the scope of the study, but that we capitalize on this opportunity of having these municipalities at the table to start trying to connect land use policy and regional transportation policy to derive benefits for those that are the most vulnerable in our communities.
Thanks, Alex. I think that makes a lot of sense. And when we get into our future conditions analysis and we're looking at anticipated growth within our project area, we can sit down with all of our municipal stakeholders and sort of talk about our findings, see what we are anticipating is going to come in the future, and talk to municipalities about the implications for that. So we're happy to convene a conversation around that.
Thank you.
Maria Belen.
Thanks, Doug. I think part of my comments were similar to Alex's comments. being in the epicenter of the pandemic, we've heard a lot of how things can't go back to normal and we have to do things differently in terms of who do we prioritize and who are the frontline workers, the frontline employees, the most vulnerable communities. And so I guess from my perspective, I would like to see, as I hear that there should be an emphasis on the growth, I actually would like to see an emphasis on environmental justice communities. I saw that in one of the bucket areas, but I think it should be a focus of the project, because while I agree that there should be service for these sort of new developments or new housing, the folks that have been in Chelsea and Everett that have been, most recently in COVID, the frontline workers have not had access. And so what I would not like to see is a new SL3 extension where the stations are sited in these new developments, as opposed to where the current residents who are most dependent on public transit, who are the low-income residents, people of color, immigrants, non-English speaking, currently have no access. So I guess I would just like to see, how is this different than if it would have been pre-COVID? How are we looking at transit differently in a post-COVID world where we've seen who have been the folks that have put literally their lives on the line for the economy? So just making a pitch for prioritizing environmental justice communities, which means 3 things: low income, people of color, and language isolation. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria Belen. That's a really good point. And we did try to be really explicit about that in our objectives. But I do think you're absolutely right. That can be sort of codified here in the project need as well. We do care a lot, we are looking at future conditions and what the implications of those are. But obviously in this process, we do care a lot about existing transit users and how we could potentially make improvements to the existing service. So we are coordinating with the Transit Priority Group at the T and the other initiatives that are underway to look at those existing services, any implications of alternatives that we may analyze, and how we can really leverage the existing service to improve upon it. It sounded like maybe somebody else wanted to jump in there too.
Moving on to our next discussion question. It has to do with the study area. So the question is, do you have any suggested changes? Did we get that part right? Is it big enough, but not too big? So here is a reminder of our study area. Any comments on it? Can you see it okay? I see Vineet and then I see Alex.
Yeah, I was just curious on the East Boston side, if we could expand that further to the east. But also this is kind of related, but not directly about the project area. There are 2 ongoing initiatives that also cover land use that the BPDA is running. One is called Plan East Boston, and the other is called Plan Charlestown. And so those are ongoing, those are community processes going on today that would have a direct impact to the extent that this project traverses through those 2 communities. I see that you have pretty much all of Charlestown in here.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We have been coordinating with the BPDA on the work that's going on in East Boston and the implications that it may have for SL3 service, but we'll make sure that we continue those conversations as the project moves forward.
Alex?
The other piece was, I'm getting a text from my friends here at BPDA, who we're all monitoring this together. Is there any scope to include a portion of the seaport, given that the SL goes through that area as well?
We are going to look at the SL3 sort of as a whole, but we weren't anticipating doing a really extensive analysis of the seaport. There have been other efforts recently underway that have incorporated that, but obviously with any study area, we have to sort of balance what we have the budget and the time to do versus, all the things that could potentially be done. So as you can imagine, the study area could be, much, much larger, incorporate a lot more, but
it's just that anything we do with the SL service extension might have an impact on existing SL service in the Seaport area.
Of course, and we will be
in terms of sharing resources and the like. So, which is why we thought here in Boston that at least having a small section of the Seaport as part of the study area would probably help.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I just want to clarify.
Include South Station as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I should clarify. We are going to do an operational analysis of the SL3 and look at how any alternatives that we analyze will impact the operations of that for the whole length of that service. So just because the bounds of this study area don't, as they're shown here, don't include South Station and the Seaport, doesn't mean that we're not going to also consider the impact to the existing service and the changes that will make. So. But thank you for pointing that out.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Doug. That was what I was going to say as well, as our analysis does extend beyond the study area in terms of origins, destinations, markets, ridership.
Yeah, the bounds of this study area really are to, accommodate any potential alignments that we may consider. And obviously we're, not looking further afield than this as far as that goes, but we will be, as Teresa said, our analysis is not necessarily limited to these bounds for many of its components. Alex?
So this is more operational and less so about potential alignments, but I guess I would encourage the study team to hone in on and identify existing constraints to the SL3 system that could be an impediment to the successful operations of an extension or an extended route. In particular, the Chelsea Street Bridge in Chelsea has been a perennial issue for the community. It causes, immense amount of congestion and air pollution, and it also degrades Silver Line service. So I would hope that coming out of this study, we could receive a firm recommendation from Mass DOT on a solution to that issue.
Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, we're certainly going to be looking at the existing constraints, and I know that there are other conversations underway about the Chelsea Creek Bridge that we can certainly connect with.
Okay. Any other comments on the study area before we move on?
I have one.
Julia?
Yeah. I just noticed that the dotted line doesn't quite cover to the east the Ted Williams Tunnel traffic, and if that's something that should be considered in this, not that like this necessarily would be part of the route, but impacts to this major crossing of the harbor.
Thanks. That sort of gets back to what we were saying in response to Vinny's comment, where we're going to be looking at the SL3, but the study area here really just bounds potential alignments of any alternatives that we may consider. But we will be looking at the constraints on the existing SL3 service and how they may impact any alternatives.
Okay.
Before we move forward, I just want to point out that we have about 10 minutes left in this meeting. We did include about 30 slides of existing conditions analysis in the slide deck. We didn't think that we would get through all of it, so we certainly don't need to. And it's important that we have this discussion, but I just want to say that we will be reaching out to all of our working group members to share that existing conditions analysis with you and talk to you about it. But we can keep going with the discussion.
Excellent. And I know that this conversation started when we were on the goals and objectives slides, but I wanted to give you all an opportunity again to let us know if you think that there's something missing from our proposed goals and objectives. And of course, this is just a part of our evaluation framework, right? We need to figure out, as Vinny mentioned, what our metrics are, what our scoring system looks like, but the big picture goals and the objectives that we're trying to achieve through this study. Anything that you see that is missing, and I've copied those goals and objectives here as well.
And I just want to remind everyone, what we mentioned earlier in this meeting is that we are developing individual metrics for each of these objectives that will allow us to actually measure whether we are succeeding with any, or whether any alternative actually meets any of these objectives and to what extent. So that's really the next step of this process after we finalize these with your input. Alex?
Sorry, I know we want to move on. I'll be really quick, but on the support climate resiliency and sustainability goal area, I think from our perspective, you know, I guess I do wish that it included a bit more, particularly around the sort of energy efficiency and or carbon impact of proposed extension scenarios. You know, we've long been advocates of electrifying Silver Line service and bus service in Chelsea, as well as electrifying the commuter rail line that runs through the city. So looking at sort of any new hardware that's deployed through the lens of resiliency and energy efficiency would be a major goal of ours.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Travis.
Just on the competitiveness of transit trips, and I think I may be repeating what some others have said, but it says within the study area, and I think it should also include trips to and from the study area. So get the whole network.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Anyone else on this one? Thank you.
Julia Wallers.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I want to echo the part about adding in specific goals for electrification in the reduced emissions and climate section, as well as environmental justice, and also adding, you know, the word rapid in there, shooting high. Oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh, there was something specific I was going to say, not just echoing. I'm gonna have to hold that thought if anybody has anything. Sorry.
No worries.
Brad.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. Basically looking at, since so many of the concerns that are going to come up is going to be, you know, have to do with impacts on vehicular traffic and parking and road use. If there's somewhere that we can be explicit about taking a transit first approach to all the designs, that is the lens through which this project is leading, because this is new and potentially transformative for the entire region. If we could just add that as an overarching goal, I think it would make a big difference overall.
Thank you. Brad, did you raise your hand?
Just a quick homework assignment for all of us, Doug. Folks, if you have not read the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group that has the final report that has been discussed a couple of times today, please do so. And I think it offers some really helpful guidance for all of us going forward and binds together some of the themes that we have heard. For example, it's very easy for projects like that one to focus on the shiny object of capital investment and new transit service. One of the things that I was really proud of our work together a few years ago was that we explored in a rigorous way the relationship between affordable housing and low carbon mobility. And what we found was that we modeled sensitivity and found that the more affordable housing that our region and our municipalities commit to preserving and building, the better off our mobility ecosystem works. Similarly, we modeled and studied and found some empirical benefit to intentional limitation of off-street parking in new development. And the science has emerged over the last couple of years in a profound way, really starting to show induced demand. If you build parking, you get automobile mode share and you start to erode the utilization of transit that you're building. So I think there's a lot of really great study work and information in that document that it's easy for folks to sometimes forget. So I would hope that everybody would download that document, take a look at it, and think about how we leverage it going forward together.
Thank you. So Doug, we have 3 minutes left. And I wonder if we should just fast forward to what are the next steps for this group.
Thank you, Teresa. I think that makes sense. Yeah, unfortunately on this call, we're too ambitious, thinking we would get through all of that discussion as well as 30 slides of existing conditions. But the existing conditions analysis is not complete. It's still underway. We were just going to share some of our preliminary findings with you today. We will schedule meetings with each of our stakeholders to meet with you and talk about that analysis and what we plan to continue to do moving forward. Unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to be able to get to public comment either. So I just want to remind folks that if you have comments or questions, if you're a member of the public and you're watching this, and we weren't able to get to you, please shoot us an email at slx@mbta.com, and we'll be able to respond to you. But in terms of next steps, the next major milestone really is to edit our goals and objectives based on the input that you've given us today. Thank you, Teresa. And then finish developing our evaluation framework that will allow us to get into the definition of alternatives and the alternatives analysis. So the next meeting of this body will be scheduled around reviewing that evaluation framework and starting to have a discussion of the definition of alternatives. Teresa, if you could go one slide prior to this. We're going to continue documenting the existing conditions as that analysis is done. I also mentioned earlier that we're going to begin a future conditions analysis. This is where we start to look at future land uses and what's anticipated for each municipality. And we'll obviously sit down with all of our municipal stakeholders and talk to them about that as well. I'm sorry for the background noise over here. And then, yeah, we get into the evaluation framework and definition of alternatives. So we'll be reaching out to you to schedule one-on-one meetings, as well as scheduling the next meeting of this body in mid-March. And then our first public meeting should be in April. Are there any other questions before we go? Reagan?
I was just going to say there was a typo on the last slide with the email address, although Doug, you said it correctly, but I do just want to flag it's MBTA, it's slx@mbta.com, just in case there was a question.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Eric.
Yeah, as Brad said, the Lower Mystic study, if I don't know if there is a project page for this work, if there are any materials on it, but you can also just Google Lower Mystic Regional Working Group. We have a project page that still has our report up there where people can access that and they can dig in to look at all of the kind of land use alternatives that we looked at and various other transportation improvements for the sort of broader Lower Mystic area. And then Doug, when did you say the next meeting will be?
Of this body, it will be mid-March. But we plan on meeting with all of our stakeholders prior to that for one-on-one conversations. Thank you for mentioning the project website. There is a project website for this. It's mbta.com/slx. And there is a link on that page to the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report. It is 2:01, so I think we're gonna call it. If anybody has any other questions or comments, please feel free to reach out. If you're a working group member, you have my email, please feel free to reach out to me directly as well. And we're looking forward to doing this work with you. I hope you're all as excited as we are to continue in this process. Thank you all very much. Have a good afternoon. And I hope that not too much snow falls and you're able to dig out your sidewalks.
I think it's turning to rain.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.